Ahoy! While yesterday's patch came with a variety of progression fixes as well as bug fixes, there is one change in particular that I want to spend some more time on. We're going to look at the Unyielding change and what that means for different light armor options now. The Unyielding helm artifact had its weight decreased slightly. We're talking a 0.3 weight difference compared to normal heavy helms. That may not sound like much, but it's important because it allows you to slot Unyielding in a light build. So here I want to put it side by side with other defensive options people are using, being Featherweight as well as Tumbler Feetwraps. This comparison will not include shields because you literally cannot run Unyielding with a shield in light. First, here's an overview of the new armor values for 700 gear score for light, medium and heavy armor. These are the values that we're going to use in all of these comparisons. You can see our two outliers at the bottom. We have Unyielding, which has the normal heavy armor value but weighs ever so slightly less. And we also have Featherweight with the normal light chest value with no weight at all. And since we're already at it, here's a quick overview of all the current mitigation values without any artifacts. L standing for light, M for medium, H for heavy. So the first loadout here would be light head, medium chest, light gloves, light legs and light feet. Our normal mitigation in light is 28%, and this is also true for a loadout with medium pants and another medium piece but a light chest instead. For reference, the two most popular medium loadouts have roughly 42% mitigation, and a heavy loadout with full heavy has 50% mitigation. This is before factoring in various constitution passives and other effects that can increase this further. So 28% is our baseline for light. However, if we are running Featherweight, then we are able to slot more heavy pieces. That's one of the big advantages of running Featherweight. The typical approach that I've seen so far is slotting two heavy pieces along with it, being either your gloves or your head or your shoes. That results in a heavy, light, loadout, which has a total armor of 1162. So this is still sitting closer to a light loadout than to a medium loadout, but it comes with 34% mitigation. This is also especially why I see a lot of people favoring this in PvE at the moment. It just gives you a fair bit of extra safety while maintaining the same mobility. Featherweight comes with refreshing and physical aversion, which aren't exactly the perks we're currently after. Refreshing is very easy to come by in your build, and physical aversion is arguably the weakest version of damage reduction that you can currently have for most situations. So for the highest versatility, most people will likely slot health on this in the last slot, as long as it's somewhat affordable to do so. Next up, Tumbler Feetwraps. Tumbler Feetwraps are just light footwear, so you can run a very traditional light, medium, light loadout, resulting in us having 883.7 armor, so very standard there. But we can also compare the value here after actually getting the effect from Tumbler Feetwraps, which is the dodge, which gives you an extra 25% fortify. Under those circumstances, you would have 1104.6 armor. In other words, while the shirking effect is not active, we have 28% damage mitigation, whilst active we have roughly 33%. That is not quite as much as Featherweight, but in many situations this will be offset by the additional heal. You're healed for 200 plus 2% of your maximum HP, which could result in you actually having more effective health through this. Now, as far as I'm aware, the Tumbler's bug was also not yet fixed in this patch, at least wasn't in the notes anywhere, which would mean it still often heals for way too much. So I'd expect that on average in PvP situations, Tumbler Feetwraps will likely provide you with more additional survivability compared to Featherweight, whereas in PvE, if I was after survivability specifically, I would opt towards Featherweight. Once it's fixed, to some degree it'll also come down to how well you dodge, and it's also worth keeping in mind that you can kind of dodge out of the shirking effect range with light equip load, so there are a few risks, a few considerations here. On the other hand, you also get a 15% empower. Tumbler Feetwraps comes with the same perks as Featherweight, also with refreshing and physical aversion. Again, not the most highly valued perks, especially in PvP, and you would once again likely slot health here for a more consistent overall mitigation in most situations. And that brings us to the new kid on the block of light armors. I'm not sure where I'm going with that. Unyielding. Unyielding as a heavy headpiece actually has a slightly higher mitigation value, a slightly higher armor value than a traditional light loadout. So you're going to run a heavy, light loadout in this case, with the helm being your heavy option. This results in your total armor being 924. That is roughly a 29% mitigation. But beyond its effect, which we'll get to in a second, Unyielding also comes with slightly different perks. It comes with Refreshing as well, but it comes with Shirking Fortification along with that. And Shirking Fortification, in my opinion, is a much more potent all-rounder than Physical Aversion specifically, since it affects almost all sources of damage and not one that's barely used at the moment with all the elemental builds going around. If we factor in the extra mitigation we get from this piece of Shirking Fortification, which we cannot get on the others if we lock health on all three of them, then we would have 973.4 armor while the Shirking effect is active. That would give us 30% mitigation. Now the same disclaimers that applied for Tumbler would obviously apply here as well. It's not super consistent in Light, it's not necessarily reliable, but it is a value that I think is worth keeping in mind. On the other hand, what's also worth keeping in mind is that Featherweight has the highest base value of mitigation, or the highest base value of armor, which means that if you're adding Fortify to that, the value will increase more compared to Tumbler or Unyielding. Also at this point it is worth noting that I did not factor in the 50 con passive because that's only for physical armor and only while at or above 50% health, so I think that's a bit inconsistent to include here, which would slightly skew these values but not really in a relevant way in my opinion. But what we do need to factor in is Unyielding's passive. Currently in Light you don't really have that much crit mitigation. You have your 15% inherent reduction from light equip load to any crit damage that you take, and if you're running 150 con, then you have another 10% reduction, which I think most light players do nowadays, but not everyone necessarily does. Most weapons that are a consistent threat to light armor users can go well above a 25% crit multiplier. Many of the more damage-focused weapons already start out at a 1.3 crit multiplier and can often reach 1.4, some even start out at 1.4. Slotting perks like Vicious or Rogue on top of that results in even bigger numbers. But even weapons like the Greatsword with a lower crit damage multiplier of 1.25 can reach more than the 25% that you get in terms of light mitigation, because if you put any perk on top of this, again Vicious or anything like that, it'll go higher than what you can mitigate. Now this is only in PvP, PvE mobs cannot crit. But this means that there's a large number of damage sources that are a very direct threat to you based on their crit damage, and Unyielding effectively negates all of that. Unyielding brings you up to 45% crit mitigation if you have 150 con, which means the vast majority of crit damage in the game will not affect you. But is that even better than the direct mitigation from Featherweight? Bad math disclaimer here, this is very quickly thrown together just based on the percentage mitigation against a damage value, not factoring in various other things that affect that, so this is not the full picture, but just to give you a very rough idea of how this will work. If we're not wearing gems or any other form of absorption and we get hit by 1000 damage with Featherweight, that will result in 660 damage. With Unyielding this will result in 710 damage, so a 49 difference in favor of Featherweight. If you get hit by a 1400 crit, a crit with a 1.4 multiplier, then Unyielding would now reduce roughly 50 more damage. It's only if we're going up to a 1.45 crit multiplier that Unyielding gets a more significant advantage and reduces the damage by 83. But most weapons don't reach that high that often, depending on how they're built, of course. So generally I would say that things are in favor of Featherweight here, unless you get hit with a lot of crits very often. More than 50% of the attacks would have to be crits, or crits with a very high multiplier for the value of Unyielding to be higher, which I would say is not the case in the majority of situations. There is an interesting outlier though. Again, this is all very oversimplified, there's way more going into mitigation, but if we just purely look at a build that has less than 150 con and doesn't get the mitigation perk, then we can see the value of Unyielding being a fair bit higher. Sure, if the damage doesn't crit, then you still have the same 49 difference in favor of Featherweight, but in this case a 1.3 multiplier crit would be enough to skew things in favor of the Unyielding artifact, which you would see fairly often, I would say. But then again, if you're going for less than 150 con, you're probably not expecting to get hit very often in the first place, and you may be better off with something like a tuned leather pants that just gives you more damage, which is what you're probably after. All in all, it's very nice to see that all of these artifacts are in close competition and every one of them can be viable somewhere. Even Unyielding I expect to have much more viability in medium, where Featherweight doesn't give you nearly as much of an advantage. Or you could run it in a heavy build with less than 150 con, but that's a conversation for another day. If you're interested in more info and breakdowns like this, consider subscribing and clicking the bell. If you'd like to support my work further, you can do so on Patreon and get early trading tips as well as general tips in return. Thanks to all of my patrons who already do exactly that. and thank you for watching. Sloth, out.